Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to talk about some tentative 2020 reading plans. This is really the first time I've ever tried setting reading goals for myself for any given year. I've only considered myself really a reader within the past 4 years, so I feel like I've really been spending that time really just figuring out what I like. And a part of that has really been the fact that, especially with 2019, I feel like I read through a lot of classics. Even if you look at my top reads of 2019 video, my top 4 reads were all classics. And so a part of my goal for 2020 is actually to read many more contemporary books or new releases. And with new releases in general, for some reason I just never feel really compelled to read them. I think for me it's because I always feel like there's this underlying marketability with how books are supposed to be compared to backlisted popular titles, but I feel like with classics, their history is always cemented already in the world and how it's often perceived. And a part of that is that why I loved reading classics so much is because I feel like apart from me getting to experience those specific books, that I really like the idea of me as a reader being able to sort of absorb this collective history of how people have always interpreted a specific classic. But I do have a few books I wanted to talk about that are 2020 releases that I'm looking forward to. The first one being Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh. In true Moshfegh fashion, as I've read her before, this book doesn't seem to stray from being pretty freaking weird. If I remember correctly, it's about this older woman who finds this note, I think in the woods, that talks about someone finding this dead body, but they promised they didn't kill this person. What's always captivated me about Moshfegh is that she seems to write a lot about women that ruminate on disappearance, and I think this really enriches their character and really makes them perceptively selfish about how the thought of disappearance affects their own way of life. So I'm sure this book will be no different, but I'm really looking forward to it. This next one is from an author I've never read before, and I'm pretty sure it's his debut, but this is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This is about a boy named Wallace who's from Alabama but moves to the Midwest for grad school. And as a person of color, Wallace seems to struggle with this external alienation from being a person of color in a predominantly white area, but he also seems to have this overlap with internal strife with his own sexuality, and apparently he has this relationship or experience with a man that he meets. I've read Brandon Taylor's short fiction online, and based on what I found, I really like how he gives this very perceptive emphasis on the interiority of his characters. But also, Brandon Taylor's fiction also happens to have this habit of feeling like it oozes with what I can only describe as gay pain, as often his characters are a part of the LGBTQ community, as Brandon Taylor is himself. But Brandon Taylor also has Twitter, and I think he has a very funny Twitter, so I also expect this weird blend of humor as well. So crossing my fingers that I think this book could accomplish a similar tone, but a gay version of Fleabag. I think this next book is highly anticipated, and it's also an author I've read before, and that is The Lying Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante. Stepping away from the highly popular My Brilliant Friend series, Elena Ferrante is now bringing us a new story about this girl named Giovanna, and all we really seem to know about her from the summary is that she's told as she's growing in age in her adolescence that she no longer seems pretty and that she's turning ugly. I've always thought that Ferrante has had an endearing way of talking about beauty and making it very apparent that it's a construct. It manages to feel like overwhelming excess, like there's too much of it, or at least what people expect of her woman characters like Elena and Lila in the My Brilliant Friend series. But I also think that Ferrante champions beauty as competitive, not because any of her characters want it, but because they sort of just give in to its unbearable presence, and it almost takes on this very defeatist quality which feels awful. But not just beauty in people, but in a superficial way, but also in places. So I'm sure this book will be no different, and I can't wait to read it. And this last one is, I'm sure, a book that no one's ever heard of, or you've never heard of the author, but it's Leigh Overland by Gabby Noone. I've been following Gabby's social media since I was a freshman in college. Gabby's just really funny. I don't think she has a professional writing background, not that that really matters. She might have an English degree, but otherwise this book is about two teens who are in Purgatory, but Purgatory is an airport. I believe this book is YA, and I also believe it's like a rom-com variety, but knowing Gabby's sense of humor just based like on tweets and social media alone, I feel like she is very self-aware, so I'm sure this will be like a very clever and smart contribution to YA books. So moving on now to other thoughts about my anticipated reading year in 2020. In 2019, it was my year of Jane Austen, and in 2018, it was my year of Virginia Woolf. So in 2020, I have no idea who I plan to read, mainly because with Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf, it felt really serendipitous, where I just like binge read their work because I had never read them before. But for 2020, I don't really have any leads on who I could like consume my time with. Maybe what I might try to do, I was thinking, was dive into Proust finally. But if you have any suggestions about who my author of the year that I plan to like become all consuming with and like obsess over basically, please leave your suggestions down below. This next section I have it labeled as like yay or nay writers. These are just more writers I plan to explore in 2020. So these writers include Rachel Cusk, Deborah Levy, and Kazuo Ishiguro. With Levy and Ishiguro, I've only read one of their works, so I think it makes sense for them to be on here, but with Rachel Cusk, I loved Outline by her, which is part of her trilogy, but with her other work, it's really been hit or miss with me, especially sort of a misfire being Coventry. So I'm really curious about Cusk, whether or not I'm a diehard fan, but I guess I'll find out in the new year. Another goal I have here isn't so much about reading, but it's sort of very much in tandem to my interests about reading in general, and that is my hope to go out and see many more author events and author interviews. Now that I live in a city with like actual people in it, I found it really beneficial, especially within these past couple of months. I've been to a few author events at some bookstores, and I found it really rewarding because I've read these authors before. To me, finding out the relationship between an author and their work, and especially the great joy of hearing an author read their work out loud, I think is something that's so endearing and interesting about how the reading experience or the relationship between reader and writer is exchanged. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing that tradition of going out to these events in 2020. And finally, my last sort of reading plan is involved with some numerical value. So in 2019 and 2018, I did have some reading goals with how many books I plan to finish that I set on Goodreads, and it was a whopping 2 books. With these last couple of years, especially with my goal only being 2 books, the reason being that if I've at least read 2 books, I can at least try to compare them to each other and figure out why I approach those texts differently, possibly. But really, with 2 books, I guess it's really like having no goals at all, mainly because I likely exceeded those expectations of just 2 books, and without really holding myself to like how many books I plan to read a year, I found it really beneficial. In earlier years, like around 2015 or 16, I've always set my goal to 50 books a year, and I think for me that was just a way for me to diversify my reading palette and be able to look back and see how I've absorbed the beginning of my reading life. But again, in terms of like numerical value, I do have a similar goal for 2020, but it's not about how many books I finish. It's much more about if I would much rather have a page count set for myself, so I plan to at least read 20 pages a day of any given book. For me, I've always found that any sort of slump I feel, or maybe any feeling of not wanting to read, is whenever I've stepped away from reading for a while. So for me, just reading 20 pages a day, I think it's really like manageable, and I think it does help people like thinking of just pages to reach certain goals of like how many books they'd like to read a year. I'm sure I'll read like maybe possibly just as much as last year, but really I don't have any definitive goal. I'm much more conscious of being page oriented versus book finishing oriented for this year. And so those are my plans for my reading in 2020. I'd really like to know what you plan to do in 2020 as far as your reading goes, or maybe not reading goes, or whatever it is that you choose to do. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.